Welcome back to NewsXWorld. I'm Devika Chopra and you're watching Focal Length, where you get a briefing on topics from across the world. The Indo-Pacific has been the geopolitical buzzword. At the heart of it lies Australia, a developed nation with a proud identity, battling the global challenge of immigration. A country that needs and seeks talent, but like many across the globe, is tightening conditions on who can enter and for how long. Joining us now from Canberra is Charles Thompson, an Australian journalist who specializes in the Asia-Pacific. What has led the Australian government to tighten visa norms for foreign students? Let's dive in. Mr. Thompson, thank you so much for joining us on Focal Length. Let me begin by asking you, what has changed in Australia's rules for student visas?
Namaste to everyone. I believe just recently, the Australian government, once again, and it does it regularly, has changed the way applications are dealt with for student visas in Australia for overseas students. And I believe the name is called the Genuine Student Requirements. Now, one can read through those requirements, one can complete those requirements. Even if you feel that, let's say, Australia is a lot more promising, but in another country, you actually have a genuine relative there who's willing to support you, that must also be taken into consideration. Because for many Indian students, when they're traveling for the first time outside of India to a country like Australia, it's a huge change. And having a genuine relative is a wonderful source of support. And the other thing that I would mention is that you see that there's a big difference between a country like Australia and a country like India. In India, if you can afford to buy an overseas ticket and travel and register for a course in a university in Australia, it's more than likely that in your house you have helpers. It's more than likely that you may not drive. So it's incredibly important to upskill yourself before you come to Australia. So get yourself a driver's license, learn how to drive if you don't know, learn how to make a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, learn a bit of cooking skills and ironing, because there's no one here to help you. We've all got to do it ourselves.
Why has the Australian government decided then to take this step?
The reason why the Australian government is changing the requirements yet again is it finds itself in a dilemma. The Australian government would just love that students from India and other countries just come, study and go home. But the fact of the matter is that when you come and you live in a country like Australia and you live here for a few years and you look at the way the employment, the payments, the lifestyle after work, you really want to stay. So you start searching for opportunities to get permanent residence in Australia. And this is a dilemma for the Australian government because on one hand, it tries to say, just come for study. But on the other hand, it's not explaining clearly that it's only going to give permanent residence to just a few of those who graduates in certain skills.
The number of Indian students in Australia has increased steadily. Should new applicants be worried?
Absolutely. Look, but it's not just a question of the rules have changed At the end of the day, you have to ask yourself core questions. And even though Australia is an amazing country, and I'm sure that any or most students who come here want to stay, does the course that you're going to study, even if it seems to give you a way to permanent residence, does it match your dreams and your ideals for your career in your life? Because let's face it, the world is changing at a rapid rate. People who more often get employed are because they're highly skilled or specially skilled. Are you prepared to constantly upskill yourself? And if you're jumping into a career that you really don't like, except for the fact it gives you a permanent residence, then you're really looking for trouble in your future.
Do you think global developments have prompted the Australian government's decision?
It's also important to understand that this is probably the fourth biggest export or income earner of the Australian government. And not just Australia, but also of the United Kingdom, of Canada, United States, and New Zealand, English-speaking language countries. So Australia finds itself, just like all these other countries, on one side, it tries to tighten up the rules. But then when it finds the student numbers are dropping, then there's pressure from the universities and from the educational institutions to make it easier to study. So it goes up and it goes down. So what we'll have to see is that with these new requirements, how many visas are granted and actually how many applicants are still willing to put in the effort to come and study in Australia.
What has been the reaction of Australian people and locals to this policy change?
Most Australians have little understanding of overseas visas, let alone overseas students. At the moment, just like in many developed countries, after coming through the COVID crisis, which destroyed a lot of small businesses, and now with the sudden insurge in migrants, not just overseas students, but people coming here as skilled migrants, there's a housing shortage. And this is putting huge pressure on all the major cities of Australia. So there is some resentment because at the end of the day, there simply isn't enough accommodation for everyone and it's very expensive.
Is Australia prioritizing Australian students through this move?
One would think the two are related, but I think they're completely separate. I think the exact opposite's there in Australia. The problem in Australia is managing to encourage young Australians to go above year 10, finish their high school, and go for an undergraduate degree. So that's a completely different world. And in any case, when you have high numbers of overseas students, it actually helps subsidize the universities and the educational institutions, allowing them to have better facilities for the local students.
Migration has hit record high in Australia. Is curbing the entry of students really a good strategy to counter rising migration concerns?
Normally, all of these things are done by bureaucrats in Canberra and politicians in Canberra, and quite often they're out of touch with the reality on the ground. But, you have to face it. Australia is, a large country with very few people, an incredibly clean air. I've just been spending time in Delhi, and there's a huge difference in the air quality between Sydney and New Delhi and quality of living. So not just students, but people from every other country around the world are trying to migrate here, even from the Americas, even from Europe, and that puts pressure. So on one hand, you've got overseas students paying full paid students to the universities and educational colleges, and that's very attractive. But on the other side, you've got this huge influx of new migrants, highly skilled. And when a person comes to a country like Australia and the numbers increase, you need better infrastructure. And it just puts pressure all the way around. So it's a complicated mix. And often politicians and bureaucrats find it very difficult to get the mix right. So you'll find that sometimes it gets easier and sometimes it gets more difficult.
How do you view India-Australia relations in the current global turmoil in East Europe and the Middle East?
Today, if you actually travel and spend time, whether it's in any of our major cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, the first thing that strikes you is the huge Indian community, and they're all highly skilled. So Australia now has had, just very recently, over the last 5 to 10 years, a huge migration in highly skilled Indians. So whilst in the past, the typical Australian view would stand, if I could put it that way. Today, journalists and the media are having to learn that there's a very active Indian community in Australia, and India's perceptions and India's views also have to be taken into consideration. So it's no longer black and white.
How do you think India-Australia ties have improved since the formation of the Quad?
The thing is, regardless of which side is in power in Australia, because of the huge number of highly skilled migrants from India coming to Australia, living here and working here, politicians from all sides of the fence are working harder and harder to both understand their own constituents, who are now Indian Australians, and are also taking more notice of India and actually traveling there. So one of the ironies is, because I'm fluent in Hindi and I get invited to many cultural programs here in Sydney, I often find that in, let's say there might be 200, 300, 400 people, there are really only two Caucasians in the group. One is the minister or the local councillor or mayor, and the other is myself. So it's only natural that relations between Australia and India keep improving and get better as the understanding of India and how much it's playing a role, even locally here in Australia, grows.
Mr. Thompson, how can India and Australia work together for a safer Indo-Pacific?
Very hard question, because it brings up one country and one country alone, and that is China. And China has shown that it will push ahead regardless of what others feel, and it will spend regardless of what others feel. So it's not just India and Australia, but it's also Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. All the major countries in Southeast Asia need to get closer and talk a lot more about how to deal with this threat from China. And China's now openly showing aggression. Wherever it feels it's justified, it takes possession, whether it's in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. It will just take what it wants. And even on the borders of India and in the Himalayas, the Chinese are becoming more and more aggressive. And the only way this can be resolved, or this can, no, I don't know if resolved is the right word, the only way this can be managed is for better cooperation between all the rest of the countries in Southeast Asia.
With that, we take a short break. See you on the other side.